Today's story takes us to 1893 and follows Bella Adams, a brownied girl so extraordinary that no one, not even those who controlled her life, could explain what she was capable of. What she carried in her mind defied logic, frightened those in power, and revealed something that was never supposed to surface. This is not just a story of slavery. It's a story the system tried to erase. This is a heavy and intense account. Take a moment, breathe, and listen closely. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Every voice helps keep these forgotten lives remembered instead off-breed. Stay until the end, because what happens to Bella raises a question that still has no answer. Let's begin. The telegram arrived at Philadelphia General Hospital on a rain-soaked evening in September 1893. Sent by a country doctor in rural Delaware who had seen something he couldn't explain and didn't expect anyone to believe. Dr. William Cross had practiced medicine for 31 years in small towns where people trusted him with their lives and their secrets. He wasn't the kind of man who sent urgent messages to city hospitals claiming miracles. Buton that September night, his hands trembled as he wrote the words that would change everything. He described a colored girl, approximately 9 years old, daughter of a washerwoman in the town of Millbrook, who had walked into his clinic while he was examining a farmer complaining of chest pains. The girl had watched silently for less than a minute, then tugged on Doctor across his sleeve and whispered something that made his blood run cold. She said the farmer didn't have indigestion like he claimed. She said his left arm had been hurting for 3 days, his jaw ached when he walked upstairs, and there was a blue tin around his fingernails that meant his heart was failing. She said if he didn't lie down immediately and stop moving, he will die within the hour. Dr. Cross had looked at the farmer more carefully. Had checked the fingernails, pale blue, barely visible unless you knew to look that he asked about the arm pain. The farmer admitted yes, it had been bothering him, but he thought he'd slept on it wrong. The jaw pain when climbing stairs. Yes, that too. But he was getting older. Wasn't that normal? Dr. Cross made the farmer lie down on the examination table and sent for help. The farmer survived what turned out to be a massive heart attack, but only because a 9-year-old colored girl had seen what a trained physician had missed. How did you know? Dr. Cross asked her afterward, his voice shaking. The child's answer haunted him enough to send that telegram. I read about it in a medical book, sir. The signs of heart failure. I remember everything I read, and I can see things that don't match what's supposed to be there. His heart didn't match a healthy heart. Something was wrong with the pattern. Dr. Cross had asked what medical book she could possibly have read. She was colored, presumably illiterate, daughter of a washerwoman who couldn't afford books of any kind. The girl's answer was simple, Doctor. Harrison left his medical textbooks open on his desk when I cleaned his office with my mama. I looked at Thepage while she worked. I remember all of them. Every page, every word, every picture. Dr. Cross didn't believe her. He tested her, pulling medical texts from his own shelf, opening to random pages, asking her to read passages she'd never seen. She read them perfectly, then recited them back from memory an hour later without a single error. He showed her anatomical diagrams, and she identified every structure, every bone, every organ using the proper Latin terminology. He described symptoms to her, and she suggested diagnoses that were accurate, sometimes more accurate than his own initial assessments. She was 9 years old. She had never attended school. She had learned to read by watching through windows and studying discarded newspapers, and she understood medicine at a level that surpassed most physicians he knew. Dr. Cross ended his telegram with a plea. I don't know what to do with this child. She has a gift I cannot explain and cannot ignore. Someone with more resources than I possess needs to examine her, understand her, help her become whatever she's capable of becoming. Please advise. The telegram reached Dr. James Whitfield, head of Philadelphia General Hospital's Department of Internal Medicine, a man known for his curiosity about unusual cases and his willingness to investigate claims that other physicians dismissed. He read the telegram 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He thought about it for 2 days. On the third day, he boarded a train to Delaware. The town of Millbrook in 1893 was the kind of place that existed to be forgotten. 200 people, mostly farmers and the workers who supported them, living in wooden houses that leaned slightly in the wind. The colored population lived on the east side of town in a cluster of small homes near the creek that flooded every spring. Dr. Whitfield found the address he'd been given, a narrow house with a sagging porch and windows covered with flour sack curtains. He knocked, feeling the eyes off neighbors watching from nearby porches, wondering what business a well-dressed white man had in this part of town. The woman who answered was perhaps 30 years old, her face carrying the kind of weariness that comes from years of hard labor and constant worry. She wore a faded dress and an apron still damp from washing. Her hands were rough and red, the hands of someone who spent their days submerged in other people's dirty laundry. "Can I help you, sir?" Her voice carried the careful neutrality that colored people learn to use with white strangers, neither welcoming nor hostile, just cautious. "I'm Dr. James Whitfield from Philadelphia. I received a message from Dr. Cross about your daughter. Is she here?" Something shifted in the woman's expression. Fear perhaps, or resignation. She didn't ask what the message said. She simply stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Bella," she called into the dim interior. "Come here, please." A girl emerged from the shadows of the small house, and Whitfield felt his breath catch. She was small for 9, thin in a way that spoke off meals often missed. Her skin was dark brown, her hair pulled back in 2 neat braids, but it was her eyes that stopped him. Brown eyes, ordinary in color, but containing something extraordinary in their depth. They looked at him with an intensity that made him feel examined rather than examining, as if she was reading him the way she apparently read medical textbooks, absorbing every detail, cataloging every piece of information. "Good afternoon, sir." Her voice was soft but steady. "You're here about what happened with Mr. Patterson, the farmer with the heart trouble." "Yes, Dr. Cross told me what you did. Can you explain how you knew what was wrong with him?" Bella glanced at her mother, seeking permission. The woman nodded slightly, though her expression suggested she wished she could say no instead. "I saw the signs, sir. The things that meant his heart wasn't working right. The color of his fingernails, the way he held his left arm close to his body, even when he wasn't thinking about it, the small movements he made when he breathed like breathing hurt, but he didn't want to admit it. And I remembered what the medical book said about those signs. They said, when you see them together, the heart is failing and the person could die, but you're 9 years old. How can you possibly understand medical texts written for physicians? I don't know, sir. I just read them, and I remember them. And when I see sick people, I can match what I see to what I read. It's like the books put pictures in my head, and then I see the same pictures in real life. Is that wrong, sir? Wrong wasn't the word Whitfield would have chosen. Impossible. Miraculous. Terrifying. Those words fit better. But wrong suggested moral judgment, and there was nothing immoral about a child being extraordinary. Over the next 3 hours, in that cramped house that smelled of lye, soap, and poverty, James Whitfield conducted what would become the most important examination of his medical career. He started with basic questions about anatomy, expecting to quickly establish the limits of her knowledge. There were no limits. She described the structure of the human heart in detail that matched his own medical school education. She explained the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the nervous system. She used Latin terminology correctly, pronounced it correctly, understood what it meant. She didn't just memorize. She comprehended. He moved to diagnosis, describing symptoms, and asking her what conditions might cause them. She provided differential diagnoses that were thorough and accurate. When he described a case he'd seen the previous week, a patient with confusing symptoms that had taken his team 3 days to figure out, Bella suggested the correct diagnosis within minutes, explaining her reasoning in simple, clear language that revealed genuine understanding of the underlying medical principles. "How is this possible?" he asked finally. The question directed Asmik to the universe as to the girl in front of him. "I don't know, sir. Mama says, God gave me a gift. But I think maybe my brain just works different than other people's brains. I read something once, and it stays there forever. Every word, every picture, every idea. And my brain keeps working on it. Even when imminent thinking about it, connecting things, seeing patterns, I can't make it stop. Even when I want to, even when I try to forget something, I can't. It's all in there all the time. Whitfield looked at the mother who had been standing silently by the door throughout their examination. Has she always been like this since she was 3 years old? Sir. She picked up a newspaper someone threw away and started reading it out loud. I thought she was pretending, just making up sounds, but she was really reading. She'd learned somehow just from watching through windows, mostly, watching other children in school when she walked by. She taught herself, and I don't know how. What's her full name? Isabella Grace Adams, sir. But everyone calls her Bella. Mrs. Adams, your daughter has abilities I've never encountered in my career. She understands medicine at a level that would be exceptional in a physician with decades of training. In a 9-year-old child with no formal education, it's unprecedented that I need to study her further. I need to understand how her mind works. I need to help her develop these abilities properly. You want to take her away? The fear in the mother's voice was sharp and immediate. No, not unless you agree. Booty want to bring her to Philadelphia, with your permission to examine her more extensively and to begin educating her properly. She shouldn't be cleaning offices and reading stolen glances at textbooks. She should be in a medical school. She's 9 years old and colored and female. There is no medical school in this country that would accept her, sir. Perhaps not officially, but there are other ways to learn. Private instruction, access to libraries and laboratories, mentorship from physicians who recognize her gifts. I can provide these things if you'll allow it. Why would you do this, sir? Why would a white doctor from Philadelphia care what happens to a colored girl in Delaware? Whitfield considered the question carefully. Because I became a doctor to understand the human body and to heal the sick. And your daughter represents something I cannot understand. Something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the limits of the human mind. If I ignore her, if I walk away and pretend I never saw what she can do, then I've failed as a scientist and as a physician. But more than that, because she has a gift that could save lives, real lives, people who would die because their doctors missed something that Bella could see. How can I walk away from that? Grace Adams studied him for a long moment, reading him the way her daughter apparently read medical texts. You're not lying. I don't think you are anyway. But, sir, you need to understand something. Men have made promises to people like us before. They've said they wanted to help, and then they've used us for their own purposes, experimented on us, displayed us like circus animals. I won't let that happen to my daughter. I won't let anyone turn her into a specimen. If you want to help her, truly help her, then you need to promise mesomething. Promise me she stays with me. Promise me she never becomes property, never becomes an exhibit, never becomes a thing instead of a person. Can you promise that? I can promise to try. That's the honest answer. I can't control what the world does, but I can control what I do. And I promise you, Mrs. Adams, that as long as I have any power to prevent it, your daughter will be treated as a human being with extraordinary gifts, not as a curiosity to be studied or a threat to be suppressed. Grace Adams looked at her daughter, at this strange, miraculous child who saw the world in patterns that others couldn't perceive. Bella, baby, what do you want? Bella's answer came without hesitation. I want to learn, Mama. I want to read more books and understand more things. The medicine I know already, it's like a tiny piece of something huge. I can feel how much more there is to learn. It's like being thirsty and seeing an ocean, but only being allowed to drink one drop. I want the whole ocean, Mama. I want to know everything. How could a mother say no to that? How could anyone who claimed to value knowledge and human potential say no to a mind that burned with such fierce hunger to understand? All right, Grace Adams said, finally, but I am coming with her. Wherever she goes, I go. That's not negotiable. Agreed. Whitfield stood, extending his hand to shake on the arrangement, Then, remembering the social barriers that made such gestures complicated, he lowered his hand awkwardly. "Can you be ready to travel to Philadelphia within the week?" "We'll be ready, sir." And so began the journey that would lead Bella Adams from a forgotten town in Delaware to the center of one of the most important medical controversies of the 19th century. A journey that would challenge everything white America believed about race and intelligence, and ultimately demand a terrible price from everyone involved. Philadelphia in 1893 was the second largest city in America, a place of contrasts and contradictions. Grand mansions stood within blocks of desperate slums. The wealthy attended concerts and galleries, while the poor worked 14-hour days in factories that chewed up bodies and spit out broken people. And at the center of it all, Philadelphia General Hospital served as one of the nation's premier medical institutions, training doctors who would practice throughout the country, conducting research that shaped the future of American medicine. Whitfield arranged for Grace and Bella to stay in a boarding house in the colored section of the city, a clean, modest place run by a widow named Mrs. Elenina Thompson, who asked no questions about why a white doctor was paying for a washerwoman and her child to live in her establishment. The arrangement was unusual, but the money was good, and Mrs. Thompson had learned not to question unusual arrangements that came with reliable payment. For the first 2 weeks, Whitfield conducted extensive testing, documenting Bella's abilities with scientific precision. He confirmed her photographic memory by having her read medical texts and recite them days later without error. He tested her comprehension by asking her to explain complex concepts in her own words, and her explanations were often clearer than the original texts. He presented her with case studies and diagnostic puzzles, and her accuracy rate exceeded 90% better than most of the physicians on his staff. He brought in colleagues to verify his findings, choosing carefully, selecting only those he trusted to approach the situation with scientific objectivity rather than racial prejudice. Most were skeptical at first. A colored child with physician-level medical knowledge seemed impossible. Another hoax in an era full of fraudulent claims about prodigies and miracle workers. But one by one, Whitfield's colleagues examined Bella and came away shaken, unable to deny what they had witnessed. She wasn't just memorizing, she was thinking. She wasn't just reciting, she was reasoning, she was doing what they did, only faster and more accurately. Dr. Edward Marsh, professor of anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, spent 4 hours questioning Bella about the structure of the human body. When he finished, he sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. "James, this is the most remarkable thing I've ever witnessed in my career. This child knows anatomy better than half my students. Not just memorized facts, but real understanding. She corrected me twice on points I had wrong. She corrected me. Can you imagine what she could become with proper training? I can imagine it. That's why I brought her here. The question is whether the world will allow her to become anything at all." Dr. Robert Sullivan, specialist in diseases of the heart, examined Bella's understanding of cardiac medicine, the area where she had first demonstrated her abilities. He emerged from the examination room, looking pale. "She described a case I saw last month, a patient with an unusual presentation of heart valve disease that she'd never seen the patient, never heard me discuss the case. But when I described the symptoms, she identified the condition immediately. Then she suggested a treatment approach I hadn't considered. I went back and checked the medical literature. Her suggestion was sound, better than sound. If I thought of it at the time, the patient might have recovered faster." Sullivan paused, wrestling with what Hugh was about to say. "James, I don't understand how this is possible. Everything I was taught about racial differences in mental capacity says this child shouldn't exist, but she does exist. She's sitting in that room right now knowing more about cardiac medicine than physicians who trained for years. What does that mean? It means what you were taught was wrong. Not partially wrong, completely wrong. Intelligence doesn't care about skin color. It never did. We just told ourselves it did because it was convenient for our social structures. Bella Adams proves the lie. The question is whether anyone will believe her or whether they'll find ways to explain her away." As word spread through medical circles about the colored girl with impossible abilities, responses varied. Some physicians wanted to meet her to verify for themselves what was being claimed. Some dismissed the entire thing as an elaborate hoax, refusing to even investigate, and some saw Bella as a threat to be eliminated. Dr. Cornelius Webb was among the latter. He was 56 years old, professor of psychiatry at Jefferson Medical College, and one of the most respected voices in the emerging field of racial science. He had spent decades building a framework of theories about biological differences between races using skull measurements and brainweight studies to argue that Negro intellectual inferiority was not a social condition but a natural law. His work was cited in legal decisions upholding segregation, in political arguments against Negro education, in scientific papers that treated white supremacy as established fact. And now, a 9-year-old colored girl in Philadelphia was threatening to demolish everything he had built. Webb first heard about Bella from a colleague who had witnessed one of Whitfield's demonstrations. The colleague described the child's abilities with a mixture of awe and confusion, struggling to reconcile what I had seen with what he believed about racial hierarchy. Webb listened with growing alarm. This kind of claim was dangerous. If it was allowed to stand unchallenged, it would give ammunition to integrationists and abolitionists who wanted to overturn the natural social order. It would suggest that decades of scientific research on racial differences was wrong. It would undermine the very foundations of segregation and the legal structures that maintained white dominance. Webb wrote to Whitfield requesting permission to examine the child himself. His letter was polite, professional, framed as scientific curiosity. He wanted to verify the claims. He said he wanted to ensure proper methodology was being used. He wanted to protect the medical community from potential embarrassment if the whole thing turned out to be fraudulent. Whitfield recognized the danger immediately. He had read Webb's publications. He knew the man's agenda. Allowing Webb to examine Bella would be like inviting a wolf to evaluate a lamb, but refusing the request would create its own problems. Webb was influential, well-connected, capable of causing significant damage to Whitfield's reputation and career if he chose, and there was a strategic consideration as well. If Webb examined Bella and was forced to acknowledge her abilities, it would carry enormous weight. A prominent racial theorist admitting that a colored child had extraordinary intelligence would be devastating to his own framework. The question was whether Webb would admit anything of the sort or whether he would find ways to dismiss or discredit what he saw. Whitfield consulted with Grace Adams before making any decision. He sat in her small room at the boarding house, explaining the situation while Bella practiced reading a medical journal in the corner, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed page after page. There's a doctor who wants to examine Bella, a doctor whose entire career is built on proving that colored people are intellectually inferior. If I let him see her, he might try to discredit her to find ways to explain away her abilities. He might be hostile, aggressive, humiliating, but if I refuse, he'll claim we're hiding something, that the whole thing is fraudulent. He has enough influence to make that claim stick. Grace Adams was quiet for a moment. What does Bella think? They both looked at the girl who had stopped reading and was watching them with those unervingly perceptive brownies. I think he needs to see me, Bella said. Because if he doesn't, he'll say, I'm not real. And people will believe him because they want to believe him. But if he sees me and I show him what I can do, he has to either admit the truth or lie. And if he lies and I can prove he's lying, then everyone will know he's a liar. That's not nothing. You understand? He might be cruel to you, Whitfield said. He might say terrible things, try to make you feel worthless. People like him don't just disagree intellectually. They believe in their bones that you're inferior. Confronting evidence that proves them wrong makes them angry, sometimes dangerous. Bella's expression didn't change. Sir, I've been colored my whole life. I know what people think of me. I hear them whisper when I walk by. I see them cross the street to avoid getting too close, that I've been called names that Mama won't repeat and told I'm worth less than the dirt under white people's feet. One Mormon thinking those things about me won't break me. But If I can make him look stupid in front of other people, if I can make him wrong so obviously that everyone can see it, that might be worth something. That might change something. She was 9 years old. She shouldn't have had to think about these things. Shouldn't have had to develop strategies for confronting racism with the calculated precision of a general planning a battle. But this was the world she lived in, and she had clearly been thinking about it for longer than anyone realized. "All right," Whitfield said. "I'll arrange the examination, but I'll be present the entire time and I'll establish rules. He can test your abilities, but he can't degrade you. He can ask questions, but he can't interrogate. And if at any point you want to stop, we stop. I won't let him hurt you." "You can't promise that," Bella said, quietly. "Nobody can promise that, but I appreciate you trying." The examination was scheduled for October 15th, 1893, at Philadelphia General Hospital. Whitfield chose a large lecture hall, reasoning that witnesses would provide some protection against the worst possibilities. He invited a dozen physicians he trusted to observe, men who had already verified Bella's abilities, and who could serve as counterweights to Webb's expected hostility. He sent a formal letter to Webb outlining the conditions of the examination, careful to frame everything in terms of scientific methodology and proper procedure. And he prayed, though he wasn't a religious man, that he wasn't leading a child to slaughter. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and cold, the kind of autumn day that makes Philadelphia feel like a city preparing for siege. Bella woke early, ate the breakfast. Mrs. Thompson prepared and dressed in the best clothes her mother could afford, a simple blue dress that had been carefully mended at the seams. Grace braided her daughter's hair with extra care, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. "You don't have to do this, baby. We can leave. We can go back to Delaware and forget any of this happened." Bella met her mother's eyes in the mirror and spend the rest of my life cleaning other people's houses and reading books through windows. "No, Mama. I'm not going back to that. Whatever happens today, at least I'll know I tried. At least he'll know I didn't run away." They arrived at the hospital at 9 o'clock, entering through a side door to avoid the main entrance where patients and visitors might stare. Whitfield met them in his office, his face drawn with tension. "Grace, Bella, thank you for coming. I want to go over a few things before we begin. The examination will take place in the main lecture hall. Dr. Webb will lead the questioning, but I'll be present along with other physicians who have already observed Bella's abilities. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, if Webb becomes abusive or the situation becomes untenable, you signal me and I'll end it." Bella nodded. "What kind of questions will he ask?" "I don't know exactly. Probably similar to what I asked, testing your medical knowledge and reasoning. But Webb may also try to ask questions designed to humiliate you or make you look foolish. He may use complicated terminology or reference obscure conditions, hoping you won't know them. He may try to trick you into making mistakes. I'm not worried about the medical questions." Bella said, "I know what I know. What I'm worried about is that he won't accept any answer I give, no matter how correct it is. Some people don't want to know the truth. They want to prove what they already believe." "You're right. But here's the thing, Bella. This isn't really about convincing Webb. He's probably not convincible. This is about the other people in that room, the physicians watching, the ones who haven't made up their minds yet. If you show them what you can do clearly and undeniably, Webb's opinion won't matter. They'll know the truth, even if he refuses to admit it." Bella considered this. "So, I'm not trying to beat him. I'm trying to win everybody else." "Exactly. Webb is the opponent you face, but the audience is the prize. Make them believe you, and Webb becomes irrelevant." It was a sophisticated, strategic concept for a 9-year-old to grasp. But Bella nodded with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. She took her mother's hand, squeezed it once, and said, "I'm ready." The lecture hall was smaller than Whitfield had hoped, the seats filled with more physicians than he expected. Word had spread about the examination, and doctors who hadn't been officially invited had found ways to attend, curious about the colored child who supposedly understood medicine better than they did. Webb sat at a table at front of the room, flanked by 2 colleagues who shared his views on racial science. He was a large man, well-fed, with a beard that he stroked constantly and eyes that assessed everything with cold calculation. When Bella entered, those eyes fixed on her with undisguised contempt. "So, this is the supposed prodigy." Webb's voice carried through the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She looks like an ordinary Negro child to me." "Dr. Webb," Whitfield said firmly, "I'd appreciate it if you'd maintain professional decorum. We're here to conduct a scientific examination, not toe-trade insults." "Of course." Webb smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I merely observe what I see. Shall we begin?" Bella was directed to a chair at the center of the room, positioned so that everyone could see her clearly. She looked impossibly small in that space, surrounded by rows of white men who would decide whether her extraordinary mind deserved recognition or dismissal. Webb opened a leather folder and withdrew a sheath of papers. "Let's start with basics. Can you read, girl?" "Yes, sir." "Who taught you?" "I taught myself, sir." "You expect us to believe you taught yourself to read with no instruction whatsoever?" "I don't expect anything, sir. You asked me a question and I answered it truthfully. What you believe is up to you." There was a slight murmur in the room. A 9-year-old had just parried Webb's condescension with calm logic. Webb's eyes narrowed. "Let's test that claim." He handed her a medical textbook, open to a random page. "Read this passage." Bella looked at the page. "The clinical presentation of typhoid fever includes a stepwise fever pattern, rose spots on the abdomen, relative bradycardia, and hepatosplenomegaly. Diagnosis is confirmed through blood culture or Weidel test. Treatment focuses in supportive care and management of complications, including intestinal perforation and hemorrhage." She read without hesitation, pronouncing every term correctly, her voice steady and clear. Webb checked the book, confirming she had read it accurately. "Now close your eyes and recite what you just read." Bella closed her eyes. "The clinical presentation of typhoid fever includes a stepwise fever pattern, rose spots on the abdomen, relative bradycardia, and hepatosplenomegaly. Diagnosis is confirmed through blood culture or Weidel test. Treatment focuses on supportive care and management of complications, including intestinal perforation and hemorrhage." Word for word, not a single error. Webb's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Memorization tricks. Colored performers have been doing parlor tricks for white audiences for decades. This proves nothing about genuine intelligence. "Then test my intelligence, sir. Give me a problem to solve, not just something to memorize. Ask me to think." Several physicians in the audience shifted in their seats. Bella had just challenged Webb directly, forcing him to either escalate his testing or admit he was afraid of what she might demonstrate. "Very well." Webb withdrew a different paper. "A patient presents with severe abdominal pain, fever, and vomiting. Physical examination reveals rebound, tenderness, and guarding. What is your diagnosis, and what would you recommend?" Bella thought for perhaps 5 seconds. "The symptoms suggest peritonitis, likely from a ruptured appendix. Given the acute presentation, I would recommend immediate surgical consultation. Delay increases mortality significantly. The infection can spread through the abdomen and cause sepsis. Speed is essential." Webb glanced at his colleagues. They nodded slightly. The answer was correct, but that's a simple case. Any medical student could reach that conclusion. "Then give me a hard one, sir." The directness of the challenge made Webb's face flush. He wasn't used to being pushed by anyone, let alone a colored child. He shuffled through his papers, selecting a case he had prepared specifically to stump her. A 45-year-old man presents with progressive weakness over several months, difficulty swallowing, double vision that worsens through the day, and drooping eyelids. Physical examination shows no sensory deficits. What is your diagnosis? The room fell silent. This was not a simple case. This was a condition that many physicians struggled to identify. A rare disorder that had only recently been characterized in medical literature. Bella's eyes went distant, the way they always did when she was searching through the library of her mind, matching patterns, connecting symptoms to conditions she had read about. The progressive weakness with no sensory involvement suggests a problem with the neuromuscular junction rather than the nerves themselves. The double vision and ptosis that worsen through the day indicate muscle fatigability. The difficulty swallowing suggests involvement of the bulbar muscles. This pattern matches myasthenia gravis, a condition of impaired transmission between nerves and muscles. Webb stared at her. The room was utterly silent. She was right. Not just right, but right in a way that demonstrated genuine understanding of neurological principles, not memorized symptoms, but reasoned diagnosis. How do you know about myasthenia gravis? Webb demanded. It was only formally described a few years ago. I read Dr. Jolly's paper from 1895 that she stopped. No, wait, that's wrong. Dr. Jolly's paper isn't published yet. I read about cases that match this pattern in older literature and recognize the syndrome. The formal name I must have seen somewhere else. Maybe Dr. Erb's work. Every physician in the room understood what had just happened. Bella had not only correctly diagnosed a rare condition, she had demonstrated awareness of the medical literature so current that she knew about research that wasn't yet widely published, and she had caught herself in an error, correcting her own mistake about dates, showing that her knowledge was active and self-monitoring, not just passive memorization. This proves nothing, Webb said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. She's been coached. Obviously, someone has trained her to recognize certain conditions and recite prepared answers. This is performance, not intelligence. If I've been coached, Bella said quietly, then ask me something no one could have prepared me for. Describe a patient you saw recently, one whose case you haven't discussed with anyone, and let me try to help you understand what was wrong with them. The challenge hung in the air. Webb's face went through several shades of red. He was trapped. If he refused, he would look like he was afraid of being shown up by a child. If he accepted and she succeeded, his entire argument about coaching would collapse. Very well. Webb's voice was tight, with suppressed anger. 3 weeks ago, I examined a patient with the following symptoms. He described a complex case, a middle-aged woman with a constellation of seemingly unrelated problems, joint pain, skin rashes, kidney dysfunction, and episodes of confusion. He described the symptoms in clinical detail, watching Bella's face for signs of uncertainty or confusion. Instead, he saw concentration, intense focus, that strange distant look that seemed to indicate she was matching patterns in her remarkable mind. The joint pain and skin findings, particularly if there's a butterfly-shaped rash on the face, combined with kidney involvement and neurological symptoms suggest systemic lupus erythematosus, that it's an autoimmune condition where the body attacks itself. The confusion could be from lupus affecting the brain directly or from kidney failure affecting mental function. The rash. Webb stopped. His face had gone pale. I didn't mention a rash. You said skin findings, sir. In my experience reading case studies, patients with this constellation of symptoms who have skin involvement often have a specific facial rash. I assumed you observed it. Did you? Webb didn't answer, but his silence told everyone in the room that yes, the patient had indeed had a facial rash, and yes, Bella had essentially deduced a symptom that Webb hadn't mentioned based on her understanding of the disease pattern. Whitfield leaned forward in his seat. Dr. Webb, would you like to tell us whether Bella's diagnosis matches your conclusion about that patient? Webb's voice was barely audible. The diagnosis was confirmed. The patient has lupus. The room erupted in murmurs. Physicians turned to each other, unable to contain their reactions to what they had witnessed. A 9-year-old colored girl had not only matched a senior physician's diagnosis on a complex case. She had identified a symptom he hadn't even mentioned, demonstrating understanding that went beyond anything that could be explained by simple memorization or coaching. She was actually thinking about medicine at a level that exceeded what most medical students achieved after years of training. Webb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This proves nothing. One lucky guess does not demonstrate intelligence. There are thousands of diseases, millions of possible symptom combinations. Any sufficiently trained performer could learn to give plausible answers to common questions. What we've witnessed today is an entertaining trick, nothing more. Sir, Bella said, her voice cutting through his bluster. If I'm just doing tricks, then you should be able to find the holes in my knowledge. Ask me about something obscure. Ask me about something you think I couldn't possibly know. I'll either answer correctly or I won't. If I can't answer, you're right and I'm a fraud. But if I can answer, then maybe you need to consider that you're wrong about me and wrong about people who look like me. The directness of the challenge, the simple logic of it, seemed to enrage Webb beyond words. His face purple-led, his hands clenched at his sides, and then he said something that changed the entire trajectory of Bella's life. This child is obviously mentally abnormal. Her supposed abilities, if they exist at all, are symptoms of a diseased brain, not evidence of genuine intelligence. That I've seen this before in certain Negro subjects. Aberrant development that produces isolated skills at the cost of general mental stability. She should be studied in a proper facility, not paraded around like a circus attraction. What are you suggesting? Whitfield demanded, rising from his seat. I'm suggesting that this child needs to be evaluated psychiatrically, that her condition, whatever it is, requires proper scientific. Explained that Hugh wanted to write a story about Tom's remarkable life. Tom said nothing. He simply kept rocking, kept humming, kept tapping. The reporter tried again, asking about Tom's childhood, his music, his travels across America and Europe. Still nothing. Tom seemed to exist in his own world, a place where reporters and their questions did not matter. Finally, the reporter asked if Tom would play something on the piano that sat in the corner of the room. For the first time, Tom stopped rocking, his head tilted slightly, as if considering the request. Then he stood up, walked to the piano without assistance, sat down on the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. What followed was unlike anything the reporter had ever heard. Tom played for nearly 2 hours without stopping. He moved through Beethoven and Mozart, through Bach and Chopin, through folk songs and hymns and popular melodies of the day. He played his own compositions, strange and beautiful pieces that seemed to come from some other dimension. He played with his eyes closed, with his back to the piano, with his hands crossed, with a handkerchief draped over the keys. When he finally stopped, the reporter sat in stunned silence. Tears were running down his face. Tom returned to his rocking chair and resumed his humming as if nothing had happened. The reporter left Warrington that afternoon and filed his story the next day. In it, he described a blind Tom as the greatest musical genius he had ever encountered, a man whose abilities defied all scientific explanation. But he also described something else. He described a prisoner, a man trapped in a life he had not chosen, controlled by people who saw him only as a source of income. A genius who had been robbed of everything except his music. The story caused a minor sensation, but nothing changed. Tom continued performing. His handlers continued collecting the money, and the world continued treating him as a curiosity rather than a human being. The years between 1870 and 1880 were the peak of Blind Tom's fame and earning power. He performed constantly, sometimes giving 2 or 3 concerts a day, traveling by train from city to city in an endless circuit of shows. He played in New York and Chicago, in San Francisco and New Orleans, in London and Paris and Berlin. He performed for Queen Victoria in England, who was reportedly so moved by his playing that she wept openly. He performed for Emperor Wilhelm I in Germany, who declared him the most remarkable musician in the world. But success did not bring freedom. James Thun maintained iron control over every aspect of Tom's life. He decided where Tom would perform, how long the concerts would last, what pieces would be played, that he negotiated the contracts, collected the fees, and deposited the money in his own accounts. Tom received nothing except food, clothing, and a place to sleep. The accommodations varied depending on location. In some cities, Tom stayed in fine hotels, though always in back rooms or servants' quarters. In other places, he slept in boarding houses or even in the homes of local black families who were paid a small sum to house him. He rarely stayed anywhere for more than a few nights. The schedule was relentless, designed to extract maximum profit from every tour. Tom Shelf suffered under this brutal regime. He was frequently exhausted, sometimes performing while visibly ill, that he had episodes of confusion and agitation, behaviors that would today be recognized as signs of autistic burnout or sensory overload. When these episodes occurred, Thun would cancel shows until Tom recovered, not out of concern for Tom's well-being, but because a sick performer could not generate revenue. There were other costs as well, costs that did not show up on any balance sheet. Tom had no friends. He had no romantic relationships. He had no connection to the Black community that might have embraced him as one of their own. He existed in a strange limbo, too famous to be anonymous, too controlled to be free. He was surrounded by people constantly, but he was utterly alone. The few accounts we have of Tom's inner life during this period come from brief moments when the mask slipped. A stagehand in Philadelphia reported that Tom sometimes cried at night, sobbing quietly in his room for hours. A hotel maid in Boston said that Tom once grabbed her hand and held it for several minutes, not in a threatening way, but in a desperate, lonely way, as if he simply needed human contact. A music critic in London wrote that Tom seemed to brighten when children were present, playing silly songs and making funny sounds to make them laugh. The only times he ever appeared genuinely happy, but these glimpses were rare. For most of his life, Tom remained a mystery, locked inside his own mind, communicating only through his music. In 1875, James Bthun decided to transfer legal guardianship of Tom to his son, John Bthun. The elder Bthun was getting old, and he wanted to ensure that the family would continue to profit from Tom after his death. The transfer was accomplished through the courts, with Tom having no say in the matter. He was simply passed from one owner to another like a piece of furniture or a farm animal. John Bthun was a different kind of master than his father. Where James had been cold and calculating, John was volatile and cruel. He drank heavily and had a violent temper. He saw Tom not as a valuable asset to be protected, but a personal possession to be used however he wished. Under John's management, Tom's life became even harder. The touring schedule intensified. The accommodations grew worse. John frequently berated Tom in front of others, mocking his disabilities, calling him names, threatening him with punishment if he did not perform to expectations. There are reports that John sometimes struck Tom, though the details are unclear. What is certain is that Tom's behavior changed during this period. He became more withdrawn, more prone to episodes of distress, more resistant to performing. But Tom had no way to escape. He could not see. He could not navigate the world without assistance. He had no money, no connections, no understanding of how to survive on his own. He was as trapped as any slave had ever been, even though slavery had officially ended a decade earlier. The year 1882 brought a new complication to Tom's already difficult life. John Bthun's wife, Eliza, filed for divorce, citing her husband's drinking, violence, and infidelity. The divorce proceedings were bitter and public, with both sides airing their grievances in court and in the newspapers. At the center of the dispute was blind Tom. Eliza argued that she should receive custody of Tom as part of the divorce settlement. She claimed that she had been more involved in managing Tom's career than her husband, that she had treated him better, that she was better equipped to care for him. John countered that Tom was his property inherited from his father, and that Eliza had no claim to him. The case dragged on for years, moving through various courts and appeals. Tom was never consulted. His preferences were never considered. He was simply a prize to be won, a source of income Tobe fought over. In 1887, the courts finally ruled in Eliza's favor. She was awarded custody of Tom along with a portion of his future earnings. John Bthun was ordered to turn Tom over to Tohe's ex-wife and to cease all involvement in his career. Tom was 38 years old. And accept it as established fact. Bella Adams would bet a find not by her abilities, but by Webb's description of her supposed pathology. Whitfield learned about the article 3 days after publication when a colleague showed him a copy with an expression of sympathy and concern. He read it in his office with growing horror, understanding immediately what Webb had done. This wasn't science. This was assassination. A deliberate attempt to destroy a child's reputation and justify whatever actions Webb planned to take next. He went immediately to warn Grace and Bella, but he was already too late. The men came at 4 o'clock in the morning on January 12, 1894. 4 of them, large and efficient, with papers signed by a judge declaring Bella Adams a danger to herself and others, subject to immediate commitment to the Pennsylvania State Hospital for the Insane. Grace woke to the sound of the door being broken down. She threw herself between the men and Bella's small bed, screaming, fighting, biting, scratching, doing everything a mother could do against 4 grown men with the law on their side. They knocked her aside like she weighed nothing. One of them held her down while the others grabbed Bella, still half asleep, confused, crying out for her mother. "Mama, Mama, what's happening?" "It's all right, baby." The lie tore from Grace's throat, even as she struggled against the man, pinning her to the floor. "It's going to be all right. Don't fight them, baby. Don't give them any excuse to hurt you. Mama will find you. Mama will come for you. I promise. I promise." They carried Bella out into the freezing January night, barefoot, wearing only her nightgown, her screams echoing through the boarding house as other residents watched from their doorways. Afraid to intervene, knowing that helping a colored child against white men with legal papers would only bring destruction down on their own heads that misses. Thompson came to Grace after the men left, helped her up from the floor, held her while she sobbed. Grace's face was bruised where she'd been struck. Her wrists were raw from struggling, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the knowledge that her daughter had been taken, and she had been powerless to stop it. "They took her. They took my baby. Honey. I know. What do I do? How do I get her back? I don't know. But we'll figure it out. We'll find someone who can help." Grace thought of Whitfield, the white doctor who had promised to protect Bella. She had trusted him. She had believed his promises, and now her daughter was gone, taken in the night like a criminal, like property, like something less than human. She would find Whitfield. She would demand answers, and if he couldn't help her, she would find another way, because Grace Adams had made a promise to her daughter, and she intended to keep it no matter what it cost her. The Pennsylvania State Hospital for the Insane sprawled across 600 acres west off Philadelphia, a complex of Gothic buildings that looked more like a medieval fortress than a place off-healing. It had been built 50 years earlier with noble intentions designed according to the Kirkbride Plan, which promised that architecture itself could cure mental illness. But decades of overcrowding, underfunding, and institutional neglect had transformed it into something far darker. Patients were warehoused rather than treated. The violent were chained, the difficult were sedated, and those who entered rarely left, except in coffins. Bella arrived at the hospital in a locked wagon, still wearing only her nightgown, still barefoot, her feet numb from the January cold. She had stopped crying during the journey, her mind working even through the terror, trying to understand what was happening and how she might survive it. She knew about this place. She had read about asylums in medical texts, about the treatments used there, about the conditions patients endured. The knowledge should have terrified her more than ignorance would have. Instead, it gave her something to hold on to. Information was power. Understanding was survival. If she knew what they might do to her, she could prepare herself. She could endure. They processed her like cargo, assigning her a number instead of fusing her name, recording her weight and height and approximate age in a ledger that contained thousands of similar entries. They cut her hair short, easier to keep clean in an institution where bathing was infrequent. They dressed her in a gray, institutional gown that hung in her small frame like a sack. They put her in a room on the colored ward, a section of the hospital reserved for Negro patients, segregated from white patients, just as the outside world was segregated. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, with a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a bucket in the corner for waste, and a single small window covered with iron bars. There was no heat. The walls were stone cold and damp. The door locked from the outside. Bella sat in the bed, pulled her knees to her chest, and began to recite medical texts in her head. It was the only way she knew to stay sane. The only way to remind herself that she was more than what they saw when they looked at her. She was not crazy. She was not dangerous. She was a girl with a gift, and they had locked her away because her gift frightened them. She would survive this. She would find a way out, and someday, somehow she would make them pay for what they had done. Dr. Webb arrived at the hospital 2 days after Bella's commitment. He had arranged everything, the legal papers, the early morning seizure, the placement in an institution far enough from Philadelphia to make visits difficult. Now, he came to see his prize, to begin the real work of studying this aberration and finding ways to explain away her abilities. Bella was brought to an examination room, her wrists bound with leather straps, her ankles shackled. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She hadn't eaten the slop they called food. She was cold and exhausted and terrified. But when she saw Webb, something else rose up through the fear. Hatred, pure and focused and patient. The kind of hatred that doesn't burn hot and fast, but rather smolders slow and steady, waiting for its moment. "Hello, Subject B." Webb's voice was pleasant, almost friendly. "I'm sorry for the unpleasant circumstances, but I'm sure you understand that your condition requires careful management. I don't have a condition. I'm not crazy. You put me here because I embarrassed you. You see, that kind of paranoid thinking is exactly why you need treatment." Webb made a note in his folder. Delusions off persecution. Inability to recognize own pathology, classic symptoms of the disorder I described in my paper. You lied in that paper. You made things up. I never showed signs of aggression or paranoia. You invented those things because you needed them to be true. Webb's pleasant expression didn't change. Unfortunately, the ravings of a mentally disturbed child carry little weight against the professional observations of a trained physician. No one will believe you. Noon will even listen. You're going to disappear in here, Subject B, and I'm going to study you until I understand exactly how your defective brain produces those tricks you perform. Then I am going to publish my findings and prove once and for all that Negro intelligence is a contradiction in terms. Over the following weeks, Webb subjected Bella to a battery of tests and procedures. Some were legitimate medical examinations, measuring her skull, testing her reflexes, documenting her physical characteristics. Others were designed purely to break her. He would keep her awake for days, then test her memory.